legend has it that you didn't attend your first rock concert until 1979. You already passed the age of 20.
No, I was 19.
19.
Yes.
How are, I guess you grew up in New York, though, right?
Yeah.
Growing up in New York, how is it that you kind of isolated yourself from all the so-called New York rocks, such as Patti Smith and CBGBs and et cetera, et cetera?
Well, first of all, I lived far away from the Lower East Side. All that stuff was happening pretty much on First Street and First Avenue.
Is that much of a difference, even in the middle of town?
I was way uptown. I was way up on 102nd Street. And
Just looking at the neighborhood.
it's kind of mixed area. It's like on the right you have the projects, and it's kind of racially mixed area. And then if you go to the left, you have kind of upper middle class kind of neighborhoods. But mostly when I was in high school, I was not interested in rock and roll, I must say. I was rather isolated because, first of all, I wanted to be a dancer at that time, and I was studying dance at the High School of Performing Arts. So I would go to school, and then after school I would go to another dance school where I was on scholarship there. And plus I had a lot of younger brothers and sisters, and both of my parents worked. So most of the time, if I wasn't studying my dance, or working at homework and stuff like that, I'd go home and have a lot of, responsibilities with my brothers and sisters. So I was not really, and then the rest of the time I was writing in my notebook. I was kind of an intense kid. I was not really interested in dating much or going out, or if I did, I would always want to talk about rather, things like death or like religion or something that I was not known as like a really good date. So I didn't go out much. And actually the only reason I went to see that first concert was because there was a guy who had an extra ticket to see Lou Reed. And I didn't know who Lou Reed was at the time. I was extremely surprised when I came in and found out, who he was and what he had done. And, after that I was fascinated with his song, so I kept going back to listen.
割と暗い性格でね、で別にデートとかね、男の子と付き合おうと全然頭になかった。むしろね、ダンサーになろうと必死だったわけ。そういうなんていうのかな、そういう高校に通ってたし、でしかもそれと別にまた別の冬の学校に通ってたし、だから割とこう強烈っていうかね、猛烈にこう自分なりのね目標をこう目指してたわけ。で例えばこう男の子と会っててもね、もう死の話とか死っていうか死ぬこと話とか宗教のこととかそういうことしか喋りたくないから。それでこうずっと閉ざしてしまった。だけどルー・リードのコンサートを見た時、それたまたまね剣が上がってたから見に行ったんだけども、大変な感銘を受けてしまって、それでこうだんだんとのめり込んだっていうか、
その10代が多感の時期っていうのはこう自分と関係ないものに惹かれるっていうか、こう怖いもの見たさみたいなものがこう人間誰しもあると思うんですけど、そういうところでこのニューヨークのこの吐きだめのようなところのロックっていうのは何なのかなとか、そういうふうには好奇心は向かわなかったんですか？
It seems like impressionable teenagers are apt to go off in rather odd directions, so say be attracted to things they're diametrically opposite to what they're all about. So when you were say 15, 16, 17, you had no desire to seek out something completely different, go off and...
Well, I must say that at that point folk music was completely new and different. It was totally different than what all my peers were listening to, which was, Patti Smith, Rocky Horror Show. So I was interested in Leonard Cohen and Dylan at that point, which was considered somewhat quaint. But at the same time, I suppose I was trying to find my individuality, or I wasn't trying to find it so much as it seemed to have been kind of, I don't know how to describe it. I guess I remember some friends of mine describing Patti Smith to me, and I guess at that time I must have had a very practical approach, which was I have so much to deal with at this point in this noisy city with these noisy brothers and sisters that why do I want to go to a concert where there's going to be more noise and more chaos and more craziness. So I just thought, this is not for me. Actually, I missed a lot of things, because of that. But at that time, that was my attitude.
むしろ当時はね、フォークというものは非常に自分にとって異質のものであって、で他の人たちはみんなパティ・スミスとかね、そういったものを聞いてる中で自分が、レナード・コーヘンとか、ボブ・ディランとか、そういう方向に走ってしまった。で当時その友達に、要するにパティ・スミスぐらいは聞きなさいよって言われたんだけども、こんな混沌とした、大都会の中に住んでて、しかもうるさい兄弟とうるさい家庭の中に住んでてね、なんでそのうるさいものを聞かなきゃいけないと反発してた。
なるほどね。
So I think that when I came to rock and roll finally at that later age, it had much more of an impact on me because it was so totally unexpected.
だからこそ初めてロックンロールというものと出会った時には非常に意外に新鮮な衝撃だった。なる
ほどね。あなたがそのフォークミュージックの方に興味があって行ったとしても、周りにいる友人とか、はやっぱりデビッド・ボーイのファンだとかがいたと思うんですけど、全然話が合わなくて周りから孤立していくみたいなそういうことはなかったんですか
？It's probably an overlap of what you're just saying, that you were basically then isolated from the rest of your peers at the time because your interests were so different, I take it.
Yeah, I guess I was considered to be somewhat old-fashioned. It was like I think a lot of the people in my when I was a junior in high school thought that I probably would have been a good person for the 60s, but that time had passed and now it was like David Bowie and the whole, it was like a lot of glitter rock kind of thing going on in New York City. So yeah, I felt rather alienated. And actually, I'd say that it was a big surprise to me when my album came out, and then that it did really well, and that it seems to have come around full circle in this way.
確かに友達に障害されたというか、おそらくこの人は60年代だったらうまくいっただろうって思われ方はね、したみたいなんだけども、だけどこうして実際にね自分なりの個性を前面に出したりことを出してみると今頃結構受けてる。それが意外。
なるほどね。音楽でその最初ダンスの勉強していたというお話ありましたけど、音楽で食べていこうと決められたのはいつ頃だったの？
You had set your sights on dancing. However, at some point, I guess you decided to make a career of music. When was that?
That was when I was 17 and I graduated from the High School of Performing Arts. And I guess I was thinking rather seriously about whether I could actually make it as a dancer, and I realized that I probably wouldn't, partly because I had a bad attitude when it came to working with choreographers that I didn't want to work with. And I think I also realized that the thing that made me want to dance was not so much any love of dancing or love of the technique, but the music. And that actually I found myself very drawn to the musicians who would play for the classes, and I would talk to the pianist a lot. And I found that I had more in common with them than I did with other dancers.
17歳、なんていうんだっけ、パフォーマーのね、高校出た時に、なんていうのかな、ダンサーとしての将来のなんていうか限界みたいなものが見えてきて、でその時気がついたんだけども、なぜもともとダンスになろうとしてたのか、要するにその音楽に惹かれてしまった、それが気づいてしまってね、で確かにね高校に通ってた頃、その他にダンスをやってる子じゃなくて、音楽やってる子に魅力を感じたりして、だからその時本当はその音楽に惹かれてしまっていることが、気づいてしまって、それで音楽、に走ってしまった。
なるほどね。その音楽に走った時点でもう初めからプロになって、これで飯を食べていくんだみたいな風にはすぐ思っちゃったわけですか？決心しちゃった。
When you decide to adopt music as your new goal, did you think you could make a living doing it?
Well, I wasn't sure if I could. While I was at school, I was also singing. And when I look back on it, I really was very bad at it, because I would go down to the village maybe twice a year with my guitar. I didn't really have a very clear sense of what was fashionable or how to put makeup on or what to wear, but I would just kind of go down to the village with my guitar and attempt to audition at these different clubs, and I was always turned down. I was turned down for about 4 years until until finally I went to Folk City, which I'd been avoiding because it was sort of legendary, and I'd read about it in Bob Dylan's biography, and so I was very hesitant about going in. Once I got in, I got a gig almost immediately, and I still couldn't make a living, but it was my hope that I could at least make a living. But I didn't for a long time.
It was just something you were striving for, but not necessarily you were sure you would be able to do.
Right. I didn't actually quit my day job until like 1984, until a couple of years ago. I was a receptionist 2 years ago.
You've heard the whole story from the guy in the smithereens. We have some backup bio on you don't even know about.
Oh, God. Well, he spreads a rumor that I got him fired, but I didn't get him fired. I just happened to be his boss at the time, and I had to fire him, but I didn't get him fired.
No, he absolved you of all guilt.
Good.
いやまさか食べていけると思わなかった、高校の時だってね、一応歌ってたし、で実際にあちこちのビレッジのポップクラブにね、行ってオーディションを受けた、しかしもう4年間断られっぱなしで、で自分が一番敬遠してた、フォークのメッカフォークシティっていうところに行ってみたらもう一発でね、受かっちゃったわけそのオーディション、それでこれでなんとか食っていけるんじゃないかっていう希望が湧いてきたんだけども確実に食っていけるって自信は、はっきり言っていなかった、だから84年までは昼間ね勤めたわけ会社に、で84年まではずっとしっかり働いてた、それやめ昼間の仕事をやる
でフォーククラブにあなたが出演し始めた頃っていうのはねフォークシーンの状況全体的な状況っていうのはなんかやっぱどんなものだったのかなっていう気がするんですけどやっぱり時代遅れみたいなね見方が一般的だったんじゃないかなと思いますけど
When you started to hit the clubs or try to audition and whatnot, people had basically thought of folk music at the time as somewhat anachronistic.
Yes, very much, yeah. Yeah, and I didn't get very much encouragement at all. It's like, well, dear, if this were 10 years ago, you'd be a big star, but it isn't, so you should learn how to type. It's a very, it's like that.
だから時代遅れだっていう見られ方をしたし、それに自分に対してもね励みの言葉をかけてくれたもの一人も見なかったわけ、10年前だったらあなた食っていけたかもしれないけど、この時代だからね、タイプぐらい覚えなさいよ
でその時にいや私はこういう音楽をやりたいんだしいつかこういうのが受け入れられるはずだとそうやって自分を支えて持続できたのは何だったんでしょう
So what do you think it was that kept you going then? Lack of encouragement and,
I think it's because I felt like, for some strange reason, I felt like I could write songs. And there would always be one or two people that were listening and would come up and say, I think you're really good. And that was always encouraging to me because I had a very strange attitude toward the audience at that time too. It was very hard because I'm basically a shy person. I would force myself to get up on stage and then I would feel somewhat sullen once I was up there because people were looking at me, and then so it was a very peculiar thing. So if anyone encouraged me at all, I would take it as a great sign. Like if one person came up and said, I think you're really good, I would feel very encouraged. And also I felt like I had good songs, and I felt like if I could sing them, someone somewhere at some point would listen, whether or not it was fashionable. And it's probably...
何よりも自分の作曲力に対して自信があって、絶対にいい曲を書けると、思ったので、実際にステージでやってみるとね、例えばほとんどの人がしらけたとしても、その中で必ず1人か2人ぐらいがね、 あんた随分才能あるなって褒めてくれて、でそれだけでよかった、それだけがこう励みになった、
なるほどね。
で自分がもともとシャイで、なんていうか、だからステージに立つことはね、非常になんていうのかな、こう照れくさいっていうかね、ステージに立ちたいんだけども、実際に立ってみるとね、自分がシャイだからなんか、私は何やってるんだっていう、後ろめたさがあったんだけども、それを克服した。
で、最初フォーククラブで回り始めた時には、そのお客さんっていうのもやっぱりどっちかっていうと時代遅れの、いわゆる昔からのフォークファンだけだったと思うんですけど、そういうのはだんだんあなたが歌っていくうちに、増えてって、でこうブレイクしていくというその状況っていうのはある日突然ってことだったんでしょう。それともなんか何年もやってるうちにだんだんと、口から口に伝われて耳から耳ということでだんだん一人ずつ増えたっていったみたいなこと
彼女のファンがそれとフォーク全般じゃなくて、
だからほらメジャーに上がってくる時点でね、それある日突然っていう感じだったのか、それともだんだんこうあそこにこういう人がいるんだよみたいなことで、
You say at the time that folk was kind of, well, people thought it was sort of behind the times and whatnot. However, I guess before you knew it, you had sort of achieved, fame. What happened? I mean, why did people all of a sudden start cottoning to you, or why did they start cottoning to folk?
I think it was because of that concert in 1979. That really, before I went to that concert, I mean, it was very clearly divided. And at the time, I hadn't realized it. When I look back in my diaries, I was writing more about the boy that I went with than the actual concert itself. But when I was writing, up until that point, I was writing pretty much traditional folk songs, verse, chorus, and some of those older songs are on the new album. They're written from 1978, and you can really tell there's a difference, I think, in those songs. After that, I really started listening to music like Talking Heads, like television to some extent, to Patti Smith, who I had pretty much avoided up until that point. And I think it changed my perceptions, and suddenly I was able to write in a different way. Like Cracking, I think, was the first song I wrote after I saw Lou Reed, and Neighborhood Girls. And it seemed to me that what I was trying to do at the time was take the folk style and make it contemporary. And it seemed to me very urgent that someone do that if folk music was going to continue its thread, being alive. That it had to, in order to be taken seriously, it had to be updated, it had to be modern, it couldn't ignore the rest of the world, So I think, and also I started to pay attention to what I wore on stage, and for a while I looked like this on stage, kind of dressing in this big black jacket with my hair cut very short. This is before I'd seen Laurie Anderson, really, but there was kind of some similarity stylistically about the way we looked. And I think people started to perceive that it was not, that I wasn't Joan Baez, that I was possibly something different. It wasn't like old style folk music, and it wasn't exactly punk, but it was something blending the two styles over towards the future.
それだけのファンがついてきたのはね、彼女がなんていうのかな、フォークの中でも新たな出発っていうかね、新たな出発点っていうのかな、そういったものを象徴してるっていう見方をされるようになったから、で、その一番なんていうのかな、転換期っていうか、ターニングポイントがその彼女がルーリードを見に行った時でしょう。それまでは自分のフォークに対するね、姿勢は非常に伝統的なものであって、で曲そのものの構造っていうのはね、フォークの伝統的なもので、要するにバースがあってコーラスがあって、またバースがあってコーラス。でそういう伝統的な、構造に、こだわってたんだけども、ロックと出会ってみたら、今度なんていうのかな、フォークに対する姿勢が変わったし、それで自分のね、ステージのやり方も変わった。自分の格好にもっと、気を使おうというようになったし、だからそれまではなんていう、昔はこういう格好してたの、これで地味でね、ローリー・アンダーソンみたいな、 格好してたんだけども、あれからもっとこう人にアピールするような格好するようになったし、で本当にそれ以前の曲とその後の曲を聴き比べると、その違いがもう歴然としている。
それはルー・リードがっての
Lou Reed was kind of, when you saw Lou Reed, that was turning decisive.
That, among other things, yeah. I had also been to London that summer and had seen a lot of punk kids in the street, and they were very different from the punk that I was acquainted with in New York, which was a kind of a fad and a fashion. Whereas in London, it was very spontaneous. And also, it was probably, that was the year, I mean, I think I went to see Lou Reed the week I moved out of my parents' apartment, you know, so suddenly I felt like, in a way, he symbolized like a freedom for me. And suddenly I felt like I could think in different ways and be more experimental. So it was a combination of all those things.
さっき言わ忘れたんだけども、テレビジョンとかね、パーティースペースも、その時聞いたんだけども、いろいろファクターがあったんだけども、そのルー・リードの音楽と出会ったのが一つだし、でちょうど、その前後だったんだけども、その実家を出て自分の部屋も、にも入ったというのが一つの、原因だっただろうし、あとはその年の夏にロンドンに行ってきたんだけども、ロンドンで出会ったパンク、そのパンクのキッズっていうのは、ニューヨークで出会った、パンクの練習と違って、ニューヨークの場合はもう単なるファッションで、出会って、ところがロンドンの方はね、非常にこう自発的なね、社会的に動きじゃないかっていう、と思った。
ルー・リードにその感動したとかね、その詩の内容とか曲調も全くこうその体験の以前と今だと分かれてしまうっていうのは、そのルー・リードとかの具体的にどういうところに一番こうショックを受けたというかびっくりしたってところだったね。詩の男なのかそれとも曲だったのか。
What was it about Lou Reed that had such a great influence on you? What exactly?
I was just thinking about that. Because I guess it seems rather odd, but I think the thing that really struck me about him was, first of all, he was writing about very violent situations, and you could tell that he'd lived, that these were things that from his own experience. It wasn't like David Bowie assuming personas. I mean, at that time, it was kind of past that point. But songs like Caroline Says Part 2, or something like that, I mean, they're very violent, brutal songs, but at the same time, he seemed to have this very strange innocence, which for some reason was very affecting. It still affects me the same way when I go see him. I've seen him a few times in New York, and it always affects me the same way. It's like, well, not always. Once or twice I've seen him, he's really terrible. But I've seen him a few times, and it's like a combination of, I think he's very courageous in what he writes about. It's like he meets it head on. He doesn't skirt the issue. He doesn't put on a fake friendly smile at the end. I mean, he's had a horrible life in some ways, and he just meets it head on. Now, in some ways, my life has been very extreme. I mean, and I grew up in New York City, and I've seen a lot of things, and I knew a lot of things very early. And I guess I felt like watching him perform suddenly gave me the courage to do the same thing in my life. Like suddenly I didn't have to write John Denver, you know, peaceful songs about sitting in the park. You know, I could write about things like cracking or neighborhood girls or other things that I've experienced. I mean, some of the more violent songs I've ever written probably will never be published because I don't want them to be. But suddenly I felt as though I had the courage because he did it, and I saw him do it, and I saw it was difficult. I mean, he was a maniac the night I saw him in 1979. He was practically out of his mind. But it was so disturbing that I had to go back and look at the records, and I found that what he did is that his songs are actually very beautiful. Some of his best songs are very beautiful and strangely innocent. I don't know how I can translate that.
That's very good. さっきの曲名挙げたんだけど、
キャロラインスですね。
例えばその曲の場合には非常に残酷でね、暴力的なね、こうテーマが取り上げられてるにもかかわらず、なんかどことなくこう純情で無邪気なところがあってね。で、なぜそうなってるかというと、彼はその実際の自分の体験、その原体験というか、そういったものについてこう書いてるわけだけども、その自分の体験に対してこう真っ向からねこう立ち向かって、 何も隠さずにね、こう何もかもさらけ出してしまうっていう彼の姿勢にはひどく感動した。それはとても勇気ある行為だと思うし、で、それになんていうのかな、励まされて自分もやはり、なんていうのかな、それだけの勇気が湧いてきて、で自分もできるではない、そういうことできるんではないかと、辛い体験でもね、書きたくなった。それでクラッキングっていう曲を書いたし、あとネイバーフッドガールズっていうのもやったし、でルールの音楽に出会わなかったらおそらくそれは書けなかった。だけど思い出してみるとね、初めて彼を見た時はもうほとんど発狂する寸前だった。で彼はもうとにかく自分を何もこう隠さずにね、さらけ出してたら作り笑いも何もねしないから、そういうところがいいと。
あなたのそのアルバムにはこのラブソングも多いんだけども、その恋愛が成就してめでたいめでたいっていうその曲調はあんまなくて、どちらかっていうとその恋愛の終わりというか、私は一人で生きていけると、私は一人で生きるんだみたいなこう自立みたいなね傾向の詩が多いと思うんですけど、そういうところもやはりそのなんて言うんでしょう、勇気を受けたからこういう歌を歌ってもいいんだっていうことで、そのあなたの恋愛観をそのまま反映した形でああいう曲が作られてるんでしょう。
What about relationships, affairs, not from the more standard viewpoint, like I'm in love with love, this type of thing. It's more like, well, this could be ending, but I think I can make it on my own. The second part of the question, so thatその勇気を受けたと思う。
だからそのさらけ出すね、自分の恋愛観をさらけ出すっていうところから来てるんでしょうかという、その
Do you think you take that viewpoint? Well, that's assuming that he's correct. Because, well, does it take a certain amount of courage to do that? Do you think that's one of the things you got from, say, read, exposing yourself and laying it on the line like that? I suppose first of all, I have to clarify whether or not his assumption that was correct in the first place.
Well, let me see. Let me think about that. I think in some ways it does not take courage to expose yourself. If I think about that a lot, because I think there are a lot of songwriters who very freely and casually expose themselves right and left. They're rather promiscuous, I think, in the way that they do that, and that to me is not what was appealing so much as some of the songs are not specifically from my point of view, actually, now that I think about it. Like Cracking, actually, was written, I was living, this is very strange, when I moved out of my parents' apartment and saw Lou Reed, I had happened to move into the apartment of a woman who was seriously disturbed, although I didn't know it at the time. She'd had like a 10-year history of mental illness. This became apparent to me as I was living with her. And after 4 or 5 months of living there, I started to feel as though, and I started to write things in my notebook like it's a one-time thing, it just happens a lot kind of thing. So actually what I was doing was writing more from her point of view. I was kind of like trying to write from her angle. So it's not always that I'm trying to expose myself, I'm trying to expose a point of view, or I'm trying to expose something that I've seen, or a situation, like Neighborhood Girls to me also is about a woman who's very seriously in trouble. And about her lifestyle. Now, I am not a prostitute. I'm not even really interested that much in prostitutes. I was interested in this one girl's problem. And so that's what takes courage, is to write about the dark side of life, as opposed to, it's not so much that I'm exposing myself, it's more that to put on a happy front is one thing, and I think many people do that, but to try and expose the darker things, I think that's what takes courage. Not so much to expose myself. I mean, if I'm going to go out on stage naked, I mean, girls do that all the time. I mean, that doesn't take any great courage, I don't think.
We'll cut out the translation because it takes some time. What we do is we kick it back to the office and do it all down, so don't worry about being misquoted.
Okay.
そのファーストアルバムのプロデュースは、パディ・スミスバンドのそのレニー・ケイがね務めてましたけど、初めてそのこういうロック畑の人たちと本当に共同作業してみてね、こう10代の時のねこうノイジーでロックなんかもうあれ私嫌だみたいなこう時の印象通りの人たちでしたか、それともこう全く違う感じがしましたか。
Was Lenny Kaye the first guy from the world of rock that you actually worked with? I suppose you had maybe on a professional basis, let's say.
On a professional basis, yeah. Yeah, the first professional guy that I worked with.
How was it, say, working with somebody from the other side of the tracks? You know?
It was opposite to what I thought it would be like, actually. And actually, this is a joke between us now, between me and Lenny, because we're really good friends as well as working together. The first time I saw him, or he saw me rather, was at Folk City, and I was playing by myself. And he came downstairs to the basement, and I remind him of this conversation all the time because it's unusual. He's asked me how I heard my music, and I said, you know, if I heard it produced, what kind of music do I like? And I was saying, well, I was listening to the Police, and I was listening to, you know, the Talking Heads, and I thought they were very interesting. And he had said that he didn't hear any of those things. He had heard me playing with a nice string quartet, and I was like, what? I said, what do you mean you want me to play with a string quartet? What do you think I am, Olivia Newton-John? I was very insulted. So I wasn't going to argue with him because he had been, you know, presented by A&M as like, you know, maybe he might be my producer. So I was like, I wasn't, you know. But what he had in mind, actually, he told me to go home and listen to Nico, to listen to the Chelsea Girls album, which is full of strings and flutes. And of course, it works really well with Nico's voice, and I thought it would work terribly with my voice. So I kept resisting, and I kept saying, no, I don't want any strings. You know, I think we should have a drummer. It would be exciting to have a drummer. But he said no. So actually, the first album came out to be a lot more subdued, a lot more tranquil than I had thought it would, and than I'd hoped it would. And I remember complaining to him and going, Lenny, you know, I really wish that the first album sounded more like a live band. You know, I wish it had some energy. And he said, well, Suzanne, you don't have a live band. So that's what I did for the second album, was put together a live band. And we toured. And now the second album, I think, has much more of the feeling that I'm happy with the first album, but I'm happier with the second.
In retrospect, you appreciate what he did for you at the time?
Oh yeah, I do a lot, because what he was trying to do was take away my preconceived notions. I mean, and actually the strings worked out really well on Undertow. And once I heard them, I understood what he meant. At the time, I thought he was going for some kind of bizarre, elevator type thing, which I was not interested in being, you know, some kind of middle of the road peculiar thing. You know, I wanted to be experimental and interesting. And at the time, I didn't perceive string quartets as being that way. So he still brings that up every time I ask him if he has any ideas. He goes, how about strings and flutes? So, he's actually a rather thoughtful, dreamy guy. You know, he's very conceptual. He's not at all this tough rock and roller that I thought he would be. I think I'm a bit tougher than he is in some cases, but he has an ear for the odd thing, which is good.
You know, having seen these reams and reams of prose he's written on rock and roll, you figure he's not exactly the type of guy who's going to cut himself on broken beer bottles and stuff. we know he's not one of these crazy guys on the street. You know?
Well, I wasn't sure. Yeah, he's definitely not. He's very...
Yeah, right.
じゃあいいかな次。86年はね、そのバンドと一緒のステージがほとんどだったということだったんだけど、86年のステージってね。日本公演は彼女一人でやってたけれども、バンドと一緒にやりたいっていうのはあなたの方からそうしたいと思ってやり始めたんです。
So you were what you were saying a second ago is that you wanted to get your own band together then? Start up a live band?
Yeah. See, the first album was put together from pieces of Lenny's band. And see, his band is a real rock and roll band, and I realized that for me to try and be a regular garage rock and roll band wasn't quite going to work. You know, I realized at some point after trying to explain to the bass player that perhaps he could play about 1/15 of the notes that he was playing, and then we could get somewhere. And so, my playing with his band wasn't going to work, and I realized that I had to find my own musicians that I had a sympathy with. And but it made it easier having had the first album, because then I found people who were sympathetic, and all the guys in the band come from different areas of music, which I think is really interesting. Like Anton plays, he came from kind of an avant-garde kind of classical style of playing, and Mikey was on the road with the Turtles and with also John Cale, actually, my bass player. My guitar player is much more into like blues and soulful kind of music. He's not into the conceptual thing at all.
All guitar stuff.
Yeah.
Well done.
And then the new drummer, who I started working with right before we started recording, is really versatile. I mean, he was like a percussionist who went to Juilliard, as well as being a regular rock and roll drummer for a lot of different people. He was on the road with Sheena Easton, and it was like totally out of left field. But as well, he's like a really great percussionist. So it was diverse and all that stuff together.
めっちゃ自ら
一人でライブやってる時とね、それからバンドと一緒にやり始めてからというのと、そのメリットとデメリットっていうのは何ですか。で、ちょっとで例えばね、その一人でやってる時っていうのは、その大観衆のね、その注目が全部一人自分に来ると。で、プレッシャーも全部一人にしちゃうと。だけど普通のロックバンドだと、その電子楽器があって、PA があって、どっかんでっかい大音量でね、で何人もいるから、そういうプレッシャーとこう対抗できるでしょ、音によってね。ところがアコースティックギター一つで自分の声だけだと、そういう生身の自分しかいないと。そうするとすごいこのプレッシャーが来てね、こうあまりにも辛くなっちゃうみたいなことはないのかと。
Some of the advantages and disadvantages of A, playing alone, and B, playing with a band. Like for example, when you play alone, you basically have all the glory to yourself, but you also have all the pressure on your shoulders. Whereas with the band, you can kind of slip back and fall into your own role, fall into a part, and have the band accept at least as much responsibility as you are. What are the actual advantages and disadvantages?
Well, let's see. First of all, with the band, a lot of the responsibility still falls on my shoulders, partly because I had a reputation for a long time for playing by myself. So a lot of people started to say, oh, she's playing with a band, this means her music is going to get all washed out. I mean, because I think the songs on the first album were very focused and very compact. So I had a real struggle to somehow expand the sound and incorporate their ideas, but still play editor and cut out a lot of things so that it still sounded like me. And also the band was very conscious of doing that. We were like, oh, we can't interfere with Suzanne's style, we have to be careful. It's like, so still a lot of the responsibility was still on my shoulders. It wasn't like free for all, let's jam and have a wild time. It's not really a jamming kind of band. They probably wouldn't be together if I hadn't brought them together. So it's not exactly a more relaxed atmosphere. It's still very, I still have a lot of responsibility. I guess I look at having a band as a great experiment, because I feel like I performed by myself for so long. And at some point, I figure I can always go back to that. If my career falls apart and suddenly folk music is out of fashion and no one cares about Suzanne Vega anymore, I can still go back and play my own guitar, and I know that I can, whereas I may never have the opportunity again to work with a band in this situation. So I think of it as an experiment, and I love doing it because it's very powerful when I play with the band. I can find that I somehow can come out of myself in a way that I can't when I'm by myself. Somehow the music seems to fill me up from the top. It seems to take over my whole body, as opposed to when I'm in charge of it, and it's very. I think a lot on stage, and I can't always transcend it. There's something transcendent about playing with a band. You're lifted right out of yourself on the best nights.
この前のコンサートっていうのはクラシックのコンサートみたいにね、静かでみんな聞き耳を立てていたんだけど、ああいうその緊張感があると、例えば弾き間違えちゃったり、あるいはそのお客の一人がね、すごいバカな客が一人いておかしいね、 騒いだりすると台無しになっちゃうことがあると思うね。でところが普通のロックバンドだとねそういうことないでしょ。でそういう時にその自分がミスしたりバカな客が一人いるためにこう台無しになっちゃったりした時にどのようにその場を支えるかっていうのがすごく聞きたい。その場をね持ち直してコンサートを続けていこうとするのかっていう。
でお前実際に見たの？
コンサートだからそういうバカな客はいなかったけど、い
やだから、こっちでも見た。
見た。
He saw the concert here, and it's a very quiet, sedate affair in terms of the response to the audience.
Yes.
Everybody's sitting back and really listening to it. And just thinking that, a place like America, there's got to be like one or two blows in every crowd. There's going to be somebody who like shout something, or maybe kind of puts you on edge. Maybe kind of spoils just the moment or something. Does that ever happen? If it does happen, how do you
It happens more than once, but I mean, the thing is, the crowd, I mean, the first time I played with my synth player, he came on stage feeling very depressed because he said he felt like he was playing in a library. and he'd been on the road with Kashif before that.
Oh,
it was like, wild,
dance floor.
Yeah, so sometimes it's like the library, but my favorite ones are ones where people do shout things out, and actually people do shout things out. Somehow in America it got to the point where it was like a question and answer series where people would ask me things, are you married, or what's your favorite color, what did you have for dinner, or why did the queen kill the soldier, and I like that because then I get to talk to them and it makes me come out of, it breaks the ice and I feel more familiar with them. And they have a good time. I mean, they have a good time. And the thing is, in some of the countries where even if I didn't ask them to do that, they would do it. In Scotland and in Ireland, I could not get them to be quiet. They were like, I felt like I was the substitute teacher for 2,000 drunken men, shouting things at me, going, Suzanne, and singing Small Blue Thing. 2,000 men are sitting there singing Small Blue Thing in perfect unison. I almost fainted. It was in Belfast, and
I thought it was a soccer game.
I thought it was wild. But I like that to some degree. But when I opened for John Cale in Amsterdam, again, I thought, man, I'm going to come out on the stage, and if I'm not good, they could kill me, because that's the way these concerts are. And actually, they turn out to be very funny. I mean, they'll shout things out, but that's part of being professional, is you accept these things. And the thing is, I'm pretty quick with them, too, and I like to make them laugh. So sometimes it works really well to break up the ice and to... I could sense that there was a little bit of, there was some sympathy from the audience, Monday night, that the guy who shouted, I love you, I appreciate that kind of thing when they can shout things out. I don't usually feel thrown unless someone asks me something insulting, and a couple of people will do that, and they'll try and get the better of me, and it's annoying, so then I have to put them in their place, and then I have to go on with the show,
That's not a problem, basically kind of smooth
I feel like I can handle it pretty well.
じゃあ時間ないんで最後の質問。
Okay, one last question.
スティングはかつてその大観衆のこの喝采を浴びて演奏している時にこそ自分は最も孤独を感じると。で、皆の注目を集めている時こそが一番強烈な孤独なんだって言ってたんですけど、あなたはどうでしょうか。
Once in an interview, Sting said that it's when you're in front of screaming masses that you can really experience the most intense feeling of solitude.
Yeah.
I don't know if you meant that or not, but how about you? What do you think? Is that something that is relevant to what?
Yes. Yeah. As a matter of fact, it's strange because that very image happens in the song. That the title of that song is called Solitude. The title of the record is called Solitude Standing. And there's one verse in that song where it says, I turn to the crowd as they're watching. They're sitting all together in the dark and the warm, and I wanted to be in there among them. And suddenly I see how their eyes are gathered into one. And then it's like solitude. Solitude in the song is a woman who is like calling me. So then I like feel her calling me again. That does happen once in a while on stage where I'll feel as though I'm in some kind of huge desert, and it's like everybody's eyes all gather into one. It's as intense as though it were a huge sun. I mean, it really beats down on you. It's really can be very difficult when you remember what you're doing. And suddenly you realize that you're on stage in Brussels or something, and 1,200 people are staring at you, and and you feel as though you were 4 years old again. Everyone is, it's a very intense feeling.
You think it would be like a celebration of solitude, though? Like something that maybe on the surface it seems very scary, but it's also something you kind of get a thrill from.
It must, because I keep doing it. I think also along with that, that feeling of being special or singled out, which has a double thing to it. On the one hand, you feel special. On the other hand, you feel horrible because you're always feeling that isolation. I would agree with him. Sometimes it's like that. But then on the other hand, there are those nights where you can make them laugh and they make you laugh, and it's as though everyone's there all together, and it's like there's no separation between them. And that's also really good when that happens. But it's the most unusual feeling to feel that on stage. I remember feeling as though I felt something familiar, and then I had to remember what it was, and I said, it's loneliness, that's what it is. And it was a very odd thing to feel lonely in front of 1,200 people. It's like, how's it possible? Or even here, where when I first came here, I felt very isolated. Even though people would recognize me in the street, I would still feel very separate. And now, I guess, because I'm more acquainted with Tokyo, I don't feel that way.